Australia is a signatory to the International Convention, Refugee Convention, and has to abide by international refugee law. Seeking asylum when faced with a well-founded fear of persecution is not illegal, it is a right. Yet, if you were to believe the political debate in this country, you could be forgiven for thinking that the country was being illegally invaded. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The number of asylum seeker arrivals in 2010 was 6,879. Now, my colleagues here in Australia tell me that is equivalent to just 6.8% of those who attended the Australian Football League Grand Final yesterday at the MCG. I was told that I can't give a speech in Australia without making a reference to football. Now, of course, compared to countries like France and Germany that receive over 40,000 asylum claims a year, or Sweden that receives more than 30,000 a year, the numbers are simply negligible. They account for only about 2% of those coming to the Western world. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world and cannot say that it does not have the resources to support such small numbers of people. It should never have been possible to contemplate sending asylum seekers to Malaysia, outsourcing its obligations to a country which regularly canes, detains, and abuses asylum seekers and refuses to sign the UN Refugee Convention. More generally, it should be unthinkable to have the offshore model of processing which Australia has innovated, which fundamentally works on the principle of out of sight is out of mind. Under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, Australia is obliged to treat asylum seekers humanely by fully recognizing their rights and respecting those rights. It has repeatedly failed to do so, and the High Court, fortunately, has once again reminded the elected leaders of their international commitments. Let us be clear. The proposed amendments to the Migration Act clearly contravene Australia's legal obligations under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. And I don't believe that they are in line with the values of the people who make up this country either. The other issue where Australia has failed to live up to its ideals on human rights is the way it has treated its 500,000 strong Aboriginal population. The disadvantage experienced by Aboriginal people in Australia has long been described as a national disgrace. The Northern Territory intervention of 2007 and subsequent suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act as it applied to Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory has seriously eroded their rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which Australia has endorsed. The apology of the former Prime Minister was welcomed by many inside and outside Australia. But as an Amnesty International report published just 2 months ago shows how, starved of essential services, Aboriginal people living in traditional Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory will effectively be forced to abandon their homeland. In short, they are being illegally evicted. And statistics tell a very clear story. With proper services like health, education, water, and shelter, people can be healthier and live longer on homelands. Uprooted from their lands, they suffer. Making choices is an absolute right. The government has repeatedly failed to listen to those who are most affected by the decisions which it takes. It needs to do so. Free, prior, informed consent is not optional. It's a right that is bestowed on all Indigenous communities across the world through the UN Declaration. Now, despite the partial reinstatement of the Racial Discrimination Act, discriminatory measures are still in place that fall foul of international human rights law. I'll be visiting the ironically named Utopia to meet Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory to get a first-hand sense of this crisis. But it's clear that the policies followed by the government now are not closing but widening the gap. Aboriginal people should be empowered and fully involved in defining their own destiny, not hounded by prejudice and the criminal justice system. In the words of an Indigenous elder, Rosalie Kunoth Monks from Utopia, I quote, "We need to stop the destruction of the oldest living culture in Australia." Sadly, Australia is the only Western democracy without some kind of National Human Rights Act or Bill of Rights. In this regard, Australia looks like the emperor with no clothes. In many different contexts, choices are important. In some respects, they're at the heart of human rights. So this takes me to another area of Western double standards. Now, women should not be forced to wear veils if they do not wish to, as, for example, by the Taliban in Afghanistan or in Saudi Arabia. Nor, however, should women be forced not to wear veils. Just last month, France issued fines against 2 Muslim women for wearing full-faced veils in public. This is a travesty of justice, forcing women in France who choose to wear the niqab in public to be confined to their homes because it's illegal for them to walk down the streets of their own country dressed as they wish. Amnesty International is in a very odd situation now because we have campaigned for years for women to be not forced to wear veils in countries like Saudi Arabia. We are now forced to campaign for women to have the choice to wear a veil in France. Another face of Western power is Western corporations, being equally brazen in their human rights violations. Lack of time today means that I will not go into the human rights violations caused by Western companies such as the US corporation Dow Chemicals, which was initially Union Carbide in Bhopal, or the Anglo-Dutch company Shell in Nigeria, on which Amnesty International has done a great deal of research. Another obvious example of selective condemnation of human rights abuses is the growing silence on the part of Western governments in their dealings with China. So as in Saudi Arabia, if you have oil or if you have trade supremacy, then it is clear that the West has a more nuanced approach to human rights. So where do we go from here? The question that could be asked, of course, is that if the moral, economic and political leverage of Western governments is waning, do we have much hope from the emerging economies, particularly professed democracies, including Brazil, South Africa, India, Nigeria? The answer is not yet. We therefore face a double challenge. The leverage of Western governments is reducing, and the emerging economies are yet to step up to the plate. But these failures are a challenge and an opportunity all in one. If you have had the privilege of spending any time in the Middle East and North Africa recently, as I've done in Cairo, you will understand why I'm optimistic. Despite all the challenges facing that region, the myth that human rights is a Western preserve has been exploded across the Arab world. That can only be a good thing. As importantly, the fact that change has fundamentally been created by the people of these countries themselves, taking great personal risk, has, on the one hand, put dictators across the world on notice, and on the other hand, given ordinary people struggling for human rights real hope that nothing is impossible. And this is the spirit of Amnesty International and the global human rights movement, that ordinary people speaking truth to power can bring about extraordinary change. It was humbling to hear the message that Aung San Suu Kyi delivered from her home in Burma to Amnesty International's Global Assembly just a few days ago, where she spoke of the importance of Amnesty International's role as a catalyst for mobilizing ordinary people to campaign for human rights, and hoped that the next Amnesty Global Assembly might be able to take place in a free Rangoon. To which I say, who knows? It would certainly be a nice idea. And of course, we as Amnesty International can do that because we can do the speaking truth to power because we get almost our entire support and financing from ordinary people like you, not from corporations or governments. So in conclusion, it's not about Western governments staying quiet. That's not what any of us want. Quite the contrary. I'm sure all of us would like them to show a consistency between their messages and their own behavior. As has been said, shape up or shut up. And to speak out without fear of favor, rather than choosing where to criticize and where to stay silent. Australia was one of the 8 nations involved in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights over 60 years ago. Once again, in a time of great turbulence, Australia must show real leadership and manage its own affairs in accordance with international law. To do anything less sends a message to other nations, particularly China, that they are also off the hook. Equally important is that the new arrivals on the geopolitical bloc that claim to be democracies that respect human rights must not ape the hypocrisy that we've seen from Western governments over the years. That would be the worst lesson possible to draw from the failures of the past. The Nobel Peace, the prize-winning writer, Czesław Milosz declared many years ago, at a time when his native Poland was still a one-party state, where even to speak publicly of the possibility of a different system could get you jailed. And I quote, "Our natural tendency to place the possible in the past leads us often to overlook the acts of our contemporaries who defy the presumably unmovable order of things and accomplish what at first sight has seemed impossible or improbable." He was right. A few years later, because of the extraordinary courage of those across the region, the Berlin Wall came down. If we believe in change, we can achieve it. That's not idealism, it's a practical truth. But it needs to be the world speaking together in one voice, ordinary people of the world. And crucially, it needs to be a message which is not tainted by hypocrisy. Governments are capable of doing the right thing. I know that because I've seen it for myself again and again. But we also know that this will happen only if governments hear from people, both their own voters or citizens, but also from international public opinion. I don't need to tell Australians this today about your own politicians. Moral consistency is not just something to aspire for. I believe it's essential and, with the necessary pressure, achievable for the world we live in today. Thank you again for this opportunity. I look forward to the discussion that follows.
Head of Amnesty International Salil Shetty having a go at Australia at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. You can see the rest at our website. Next, in our festival special, the notion that society is broken. Alexander McCall Smith is familiar to many of us as the genial author of countless books, including the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series. However, here he is not discussing a fictional world, but the cold, hard reality of modern society. McCall Smith argues that the West, and Britain in particular, is profoundly sick, and its culture permeated by scorn and disdain. Strong views from such a mild-mannered man.
I agreed to give this talk a couple of months ago, and since then something really dramatic has happened in the UK that touches very closely on the subject that I've chosen to speak about today. You'll have undoubtedly seen the reports of all this in the press, and you've watched, no doubt, endless footage on it on television news. These were the riots that started in London and then convulsed several major cities in the UK. And there was absolutely shocking destruction. Buildings were set on fire, shops were looted, cars overturned and set alight, people were terrorized out of their houses and off the streets. The dramatic pictures, the really dramatic pictures, I think, were the ones of the looting that took place. Shop windows were smashed and crowds of people gathered to help themselves to whatever they could lay hands on. An interesting feature of that looting was that the only shops that were left untouched were the bookshops. Now you've got two possible explanations for that. One is to suppose that the rioters at least had some respect left, and the other explanation is the obvious one, which we can go into later on. And people's reactions to all this ranged from utter disbelief that it was happening to complete shock and disgust. The press, as you can imagine, had a tremendous field day, came at a time when there wasn't much other news, so it was very well timed from that point of view. And politicians and commentators of every stripe came up with a wide range of explanations. Some blamed the last government and some blamed the current government. Now, it'd be an interesting study to find out what is the general rule as to how long you've got to blame the last government before you have to start blaming the government that you've just elected. There's obviously a period when you can legitimately and with conviction blame the previous government, but then after a couple of months, what is it, a couple of months, a year, then you have to say that the problems are the fault of the current government. Now, of course, when dealing with something of this sort, which obviously was a really major issue, it's involving profound social change, the line of causation, if you're talking about blame, obviously stretches back decades, generations even, and that's something which I'd like to touch upon in what I've got to say, that we're talking here about a problem which has got its etiology going back 40, 50 years perhaps. But going back to the issue of blame for these riots, you really could, if you wanted to start blaming, you could take your pick. People blamed politicians and educationists, and politicians and educationists blamed people. Socialists blamed capitalism, and capitalists blamed socialism. But nobody actually blamed themselves. And that actually isn't all that unusual. How often do you hear people saying, it's my fault, it really is my fault, I'm totally responsible for this? I don't think you really hear that very often. And wouldn't it be refreshing, really refreshing, if we heard it from politicians just occasionally, if they said, yes, this mess is our fault, it's definitely our fault. Or if they said to their opponents, look, please don't blame yourselves, it was us. It really was us. We're the ones to blame. You don't really get that. Now, on the subject of blame, incidentally, in the UK, the most popular people to blame for most things are these days bankers. Now, there's no doubt that we had in the UK a bunch of bankers who were real shockers. Your Australian bankers, like your treasurers, were much, much better. Australian bankers walked on water. They really did. If you look out over Sydney Harbour, you'd see groups of bankers walking to work. Walking to work. Amazing sight. But not in the UK and the US. No, it's the bankers are to blame for everything. The weather isn't behaving itself. The bankers, they're responsible. Difficulties with the rail network, bankers, of course. Bankers. Problems with the banking system, bankers. Well, that's reasonable enough, I suppose. But anyway, let's get back to the riots and to those appalling incidents. One of the most shocking incidents was an attack on a Malaysian student in London who was knocked to the ground, had his jaw broken, and he was then robbed of his bicycle. A man came up to help him, got him up to his feet, and as he did so, he robbed him of the contents of his rucksack. And at the end of all this appalling treatment, the student had the grace to remark that he still liked the UK and that he thought it was a great place. He also remarked that this wouldn't have happened in Malaysia, which he said was a well-organized country where the police did their job efficiently. Now, on that point of the police reaction, the extraordinary thing was that in many cases the police actually failed to act. Calls for help were ignored, and people were left to wait in terror for the mayhem to subside. And as a result, people felt, quite understandably, that the state had simply failed to help them. And on that subject of policing, one of the interesting things about policing in the UK is how touchy-feely it's become. Police forces now all have their logos and mission statements. Everybody has to have a mission statement, and that includes the police. And their mission statements are all things like helping communities to help themselves or working with you for a better future. Now, what people actually want from police mission statements is probably something like stopping crime and catching criminals, or stopping looting and wide-scale arson. That would be a start. Now, let's look at the cause of these riots. There were plenty of pundits with theories ranging from the overly simplistic to the overly complex. But one thing emerged, though, was that the majority of those who were charged with rioting offences already had quite a number of convictions. Many had no job, and they were, in every sense, I suppose, the dispossessed. But it wasn't just the dispossessed who went on the rampage. Some of the people who helped themselves to the shops and burnt things actually were quite comfortably off, and their reason, therefore, for participating in this must have been different. After all, how many sets of trainers does one actually need? It was interesting also to see how many children were involved. Some of the rioters were as young as 10, and one 12-year-old was charged with throwing bottles and petrol bombs and other items at the police, and also with looting. But at least he looted childhood things. In his case, he looted bags of potato chips and chocolates, a refreshing sign that conventional childhood tastes were still there to assert themselves. Now, the Mayor of London obviously had to make some remark about all this. He's a rather colourful and controversial figure called Boris Johnson, one of the few politicians available to us with seriously disorganised hair, and which therefore makes one rather trust him, actually. And this is what Boris Johnson said. He said, "The overwhelming majority, of course, came from lower socio-economic groups, from the ranks of those who've been left the furthest behind. It's been said of these young people, and they say it themselves, that the world holds nothing for them, that they have no jobs and no future." And then he went on to say, "Insofar as that is true, it's something we can try to tackle, but it's just not true to say that there are no jobs available. The London service economy is substantially dependent on migrant labour, much of it from Eastern Europe, and employers confirm that these migrants have skill sets and a work ethic that you cannot find in many native-born Londoners. Yes, these young people have been betrayed, but they've been betrayed by an educational system and family background that failed to give them discipline or hope or ambition or a simple ability to tell right from wrong. We still have," he went on, "we still have 1 in 4 London 11-year-olds functionally illiterate. No wonder they're angry and alienated." Well, that's Boris Johnson's view. Is he right? Have we failed these young people? And the answer, in my view, is that we have, yes. We've failed them dramatically and deeply. These riots are due to our failure, our fault. They're our fault because we've allowed a generation to develop that seems to lack the fundamental requirements to live constructively in society. We've allowed the growth of a class of virtually feral people, unsocialised, aimless and alienated. But it's important to remember one thing in saying this: it's not their fault that they are like that. They have been made that way by the sort of society we've become. They're the consequence of developments that were occurring before most of them were born. What I'd like to say briefly here today is to tease out the idea that there's a profound sickness in some contemporary cultures, especially in Britain, and that we need to do something about it as soon as possible. We don't really need to talk about it anymore. We don't need commissions of inquiry. We need immediate and radical commitment. Is that a dangerous idea? Well, I suppose it is, because it challenges many currently held educational and cultural beliefs that have become a sort of creed, a set of beliefs that we're all expected to subscribe to and not to question. But it's precisely those beliefs, I think, that have got us where we are. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that there are dangers in this sort of discussion, and in particular, I'm aware of the issue of moral panic. Moral panics occur when a relatively insignificant threat is blown up out of all proportion to justify some extreme proposition about the remedy or indeed about the cause. And obviously there's a real danger of moral panic over situations like this, and that wouldn't be helpful. But at the same time, I think we should be careful not to dismiss as moral panic real concern that people might have over things going wrong. For example, concern over fascism in the 1930s was not moral panic. It was well-placed and appropriate concern, and of course the situation then was fraught with danger, which eventually materialised. So I think it would be a bad thing if people were prevented from expressing concern by worries that they might be accused of promoting moral panic. I think we've been far too complacent about what's been happening. We've been far too much in denial to see these developments for what they are, and now we see these vivid and destructive outbreaks of social disorder. I think what's actually operating there is a sort of optimism. We want things to go well. We want the world to be a nice place. We want to believe that even if there are problems, then they're problems that are not too serious, or they're problems that will resolve themselves in time. And that sort of attitude, of course, in another context, leads to denial of global warming. It also leads to the denial of social threats. We decide that there are certain things we just don't want to talk about, and we'll believe that by ignoring them, the issue will go away. Every society, I think, has that tendency in relation to some problems. Every society has issues like that. And the problem is that we've laughed at and mocked people who talk of the broken society. Well, here are the consequences. In acres of burnt-out shops and homes, in the destruction of people's livelihoods, in the terrorising of innocent members of the public. Shame on us for not facing up to the signs of social collapse and disintegration, for not facing up to the fact that we've allowed a whole lot of people to grow up without values of any sort, for letting our society be consumed by a wave of violence, drunkenness, and, importantly, sheer mind-numbing superficiality and false values.